Welcome, everybody, to today's distinguished speaker series. This is another iteration of the distinguished speaker series for the Center for Data and Computing. Before we turn to the main event today, which is our esteemed guest, Professor Victoria Stodden, I just wanted to say a few words on the Center for Data and Computing and remind you who we are, what we do, and the center that basically is bringing you this talk today. The Center for Data and Computing is a relatively new center on campus. We are the incubator for data science research on campus. The mission is to look at a range of, or encourage faculty and postdocs, undergrads, grad students, researchers across campus to look at a range of scientific and societal questions through applications in data science, and that could be applications, models, algorithms, systems, and platforms. We have a seed grant program that is designed to help encourage cross-disciplinary projects in data science, incubating new projects in this area. That deadline just passed this year, but stay tuned, because after the speaker series concludes, we're going to have a series of events surrounding last year's seed grantees who have been doing some really exciting work. And before long, we'll have a new round of seed grantees as well to tell you about. We also do convenings such as this one. Thank you for coming. We're excited for today's talk. And also, we partner with groups across campus, with industry, civil society, and others to advance the agenda for data science, both in terms of research and in applications to broader societal problems. Here we are. We are fourth out of 5 in our exciting speaker series for the fall. I wanted to remind you that we do have one final talk. That's December 6th, where Juliana Ferreira is going to be talking about urban data. And one final reminder for our participants, both in the room and online. If you wish to ask a question, but you're either not in the room or you're too shy to ask, you can use Slido, and there's a hashtag there, Stodden CDAC, through which you can submit questions, and we will pick those up. Now to the main event. We are very fortunate today to be hosting Professor Victoria Stodden, who is an associate professor in the Information School at the University of Illinois. Victoria's work is in the area of reproducibility in computational science. She basically looks at a broad range of questions in this area, looking at how we can ensure reliability and usefulness in scientific results as experiments and computation surrounding data become increasingly complex and hairy. I've been having quite a few interesting chats with Victoria over the past few days about what reproducibility means. I can't even say it. And the challenges that of reproducibility across a variety of disciplines, both my own and across computer science and across the sciences. In addition to her research work, Victoria is also a leader in the computer science community. She was on the NSF Advisory Committee for Cyber Infrastructure, as well as the Advisory Committee for SIZE, which many of us know and love. She also recently completed a report on responsible and reproducible science as part of the National Academies Committee. So without further ado, let's welcome Victoria to tell us all about reproducibility in data science.
Okay. Yeah. It's a geriatric machine.
There,
okay, there we go. It's mine.
There we go. I'll leave
Thank
it to
you. Thank you. Okay. Great. Let's try this. I think we got it. Thank you so much, Nick. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm noticing it's a full house, which is just fantastic. A couple of administrative details. It's on. Yeah. Can you hear me now? I think you can hear me. Yeah, okay, let me move this up. I think that's what's going on. Administrative details. My talk slides are on my website. You should be able to grab them if you feel like following along on your own pace and you don't want to necessarily follow the pace that I'm setting. The other thing is I enjoy very much questions during the presentation, so if there is something that doesn't sit well with you on a slide or reminds you of something, just feel free to jump in. Having said that, if we run out of time, we run out of time. But I would rather have an engaged conversation than you guys sort of listening to me and who knows what kind of connection is going on there. So I put a slightly provocative title here. So reproducibility is not a crisis. Okay, so now what do we do? And what I would like to do is spend my time giving a little bit of background to that statement. So I wanted to start with some of the definitions. Nick alluded to the importance of at least making a comment about definitions, but I have something to say for you. I'd like to introduce a framing for thinking about things like data science as a life cycle with a particular life cycle of its own that's unique. And so I wanted to present some of those ideas and then relate them back to reproducibility. And even in the concept of a life cycle, you can see there's kind of reuse and reproducibility built in. So I want to present that as one way of framing some of these issues and kind of bringing together issues around this topic, which is pretty, it can involve a lot of issues when you start peeling back the layers on the onion. I'd like to mention a project that I have been working on, a collaborative project that tries to instantiate some of the infrastructure side of these reproducibility questions. So this will follow straight from the framing, and with the framing I'll be able to show you how this fits into an idea about data science. And that's our whole tail project, so I'll talk about that. And then I'd like to finish with the idea, sort of paint a bit of a vision of where this all might be leading. And this I'm calling a computable scholarly record, so I'm going to present some ideas about how we could think about what that means to do this reproducible work. Sort of, you know, what does it mean for where we're going in terms of computational research and data science 10 years, 20 years from now, for example? What should we be thinking about? So that's long, so I'm going to move through this. Okay, so to explain my title. So as Nick mentioned, I was part of a National Academy's committee that ended in May of 2019, so just earlier this year. We published a report then. And that committee was called Reproducibility and Replication in Science. And the images that I put on the screen here, these are from May. They're from the launch of the report. We did a lot of kind of letting people know that the report was published and so on. This gentleman here this is a screenshot I took of Harvey Feinberg. He was our committee chair. And he is giving a presentation here, sort of a webinar, and sort of introducing our report. And one of the things that he says is that there's no reproducibility crisis, but it's also not a time for complacency. So he notes here improvements are needed. Reproducibility is important, but not easy. Replicabilities, or some aspects of replicability of individual studies are of concern. So I wanted to use this as a jumping off point for our discussion today. Okay, so if there's no crisis in reproducibility, what's our framing? Why do we care? And how do we even conceptualize this issue? Not that we're necessarily dependent on sort of the crisis framing, but what does it mean to kind of back off from ideas that have been circulating for 20 years about where we are in terms of reproducibility? Okay, so when our committee convened for this report, one of the first discussions that came up is, well, what do we mean by replication? What do we mean by reproducibility? So I wanted to present to you one slide. I know there's a lot of words on there, but I'm going to point out the important parts. One slide of where our committee landed in terms of the definitions for reproducibility and replication. I won't go into it here, but there's a very long history of discussions around what these terms mean, how they are used in different ways in different communities. That's sort of the main issue. And so for the report, we converged on these two definitions. Now, I will say I have seen some traction since the publication of the report on these definitions in different discussions in sort of various communities, so maybe there's some teeth on this. So the first thing we specified is we're going to call reproducibility essentially the same thing as computational reproducibility. Can we rerun computational steps with the same input, same data, and get what we called consistent results. Okay, so that's our sort of computational pipeline and exposure and transparency on the computational pipeline. This we called reproducibility or computational reproducibility. Then we reserved replicability to mean, so if I redo a study, or even do a sort of scientific effort at answering the same question, do I get consistent results across studies, for example? So quite different if you think about, if you imagine that you may want to take steps in either of these areas, the steps you might take would be pretty different, right? So they're really kind of talking about different issues. However, they're quite related. So imagine I replicate one of your studies. I go through all the effort, I rewrite the software, I recollect the data, I do the analysis and so on. Of course, I'm not going to come out with exactly the same answers, right? There's a whole host of reasons why that could be true that are perfectly legitimate, like measurement error, for example, different types of other uncertainties creeping into the system that you would just expect. But the question becomes, if they are different, how do I know that they are, in effect, underlying all the noise, actually the same and confirmatory? And how, have they sort of drifted far enough from the original study that they're actually counter-evidence? So that's where we actually need to have reproducibility in that discussion, right? I need to be able to unpack and understand what was done in both studies so that I can actually do that diff between the two pipelines. And right now that's really difficult. So even if I am able to go through and do a replication study, comparing the output is one thing. Comparing why the output differs is still extraordinarily difficult, particularly when it comes to the computational aspects of the work. Hence why there's emphasis in this report on reproducibility as well. Okay, so I'm just going to stipulate those definitions for this talk.
Between the pipelines, are you thinking about the experimental pipelines as well as the computational pipelines?
So I would think about everything that we need to understand. There's a total opacity in the computational pipeline for the vast majority of studies at the minute. So I have focused some of my research on that question because I think it's extremely salient. But if you want to sort of think about what it means to replicate and understand consistent results, you would have to look at everything. But I think we have a big sort of black box happening around computation and the way computation is reported. So that's nice foreshadowing for basically the next 50 minutes. Okay. So different aspects of reproducibility. So in my own work, I had called sort of this idea of replication empirical reproducibility, right? Like getting into the pipeline for data collection and generation. And then also looked at statistical reproducibility. Are we able to generalize those statistical results to a new sample? What type of statistical inference tools have you applied, and are they actually reliable in terms of the conclusions that you're drawing from those results? So that's, I think, an important part of the discussion around reproducibility that can go to replicability and also go to reproducibility. And then the last sort of definition that I pulled out on reproducibility is computational reproducibility, so exactly what was alluded to. Can I sort of see transparently what happened computationally in terms of the steps that underlie the generation of the results and be able to understand what happened in a computational sense? So let me give you a little bit of sort of a framing on why I think computational reproducibility is important. Sometimes I get this question, and it's a very good question. What do I care if I can redo someone else's computational steps or redo my own computational steps? And maybe I can actually get the same figures, tables, and so on, or substantially consistent or whatnot. I haven't advanced science in any way. So why do I even need to put effort on this? And my answer is, first of all, that's correct, right? So rerunning computation certainly doesn't prove anything right or wrong, for that matter. It just proves that those computations were associated with that finding, right? But that's a lot, and especially important as we become increasingly computational, increasingly more data science oriented, and many technical details of implementations or statistical methods, model parameter estimation, all of these decisions are often made in the computational layer and often aren't even reported in the paper. It just depends on the level of complexity. So if you think about how we could frame being in this space now and where we need to go in terms of next steps, if we think about traditionally what we have done in scientific investigation and discovery, we've thought about two branches, right? This is kind of what everybody learned in sort of high school or whatnot. So our first branch is deduction, right? My mathematics, computational logic, where you're actually using deductive reasoning to get to a conclusion. This falls short pretty quickly if you want to do something like figure out where to plant your crops on the floodplains of the Nile, for example. So we have inductive reasoning, which is experimentally based and uses a statistical analysis of controlled experiments to try to infer or do inferences or induction. So there's lots and lots of discussion, I would say maybe even more than 10 years of discussion that we have through the use and leveraging of technology and computational discovery, new branches of the scientific method. Right? Like a third branch of the scientific method, you hear this one, arising from compute power simulations and so on. Fourth branch of the scientific method with data-driven discovery and all the sort of vista of opportunities that are created by both of these approaches. So I snuck in a little question mark here, branch 3, 4. Are they really branches of the scientific method? What would make them branches of the scientific method? So just to give you a quick example, I just quickly Googled around. There's lots of examples like this, but just to give you an idea, I found a NIST workshop here from 1995, and I took a screenshot, modeling and simulation, strategic planning workshop at NIST, and I pulled out the little piece on their sort of description, their workshop overview, that it's common now to consider computation as a third branch of science besides theory and experiment. Remember, it's 1995 when this was written. This is actually a great book. In the right panel there, The Fourth Paradigm. This is an edited volume. It's terrific work in it, I think supported by Microsoft. And if you just look in the preface of this book, it says this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. So there's sort of this assumption that we're in new territory with what we're doing. So what does that mean for branches of the scientific method? Well, if you think about why we have the scientific method, I think you could plausibly argue that one of the reasons is we literally don't know the right answer, or the correct answer. That's why we're doing this research. And what we want to do is put some mechanism in place to ensure that we're rooting as much error out of that discovery process as possible. So the idea that we would maximize our confidence in the results in some way. In the deductive branch, there's a response to this. Right? You would not put a theorem out into the community and say, here's my theorem. Well, I mean, you could do it. I don't think anyone would look twice. Right? We have a very well-defined notion of what a proof is, and something like a theorem or a new finding would always be accompanied by a proof that you wouldn't even get a second look from an editor if you submitted something without that. Right? In the empirical branch, we have similar but adapted structure. Right? We have an entire machinery of hypothesis testing, how we actually use and leverage the statistics within that framework of the question in a very structured way that we communicate the methods and the protocols that were used. So for example, again, submitting a paper to a journal with the methods section blank, you wouldn't get a second look, right? You're sort of expected to report all of these steps that went into the finding itself. So here's the claim: computational science, data science, where these sort of new digital modalities are highly leveraged, these are potential branches of the scientific method until we develop comparable standards for what it means to assert a finding in these fields. So for example, what is our definition of or sort of our analogy to a proof? When we put a finding out there, what does the community need to know to have some confidence and some understanding of the findings that are actually being published? We're publishing work as if it hasn't really changed from before we were computational, right, and data-driven. We do word write-ups, like literal words, not just like using word, write-ups of actually what we've done. And I know many of you are very active scientists, and I think there would be broad agreement to say that the computational details are very difficult to capture accurately in the amount of space that you have in the traditional publishing mechanisms.
So can I ask
yes.
if you see a qualitative difference between the empirical branch and the putative computation branch? Because although at one point people might have done things by paper and pencil in the empirical branch, we don't do that anymore. And once you go beyond even the very simplest hypothesis testing question, there's all sorts of things, like how did you normalize the data before you ran the
Absolutely.
hypothesis
Yep.
test, and
Yep.
all these things which I guess I see as just expanding the empirical branch. But I'm wondering whether you see
If there's something special about it?
whether it's helpful to actually separate.
So here's why I think it may be, philosophically I don't disagree, right? And we have sort of evolved our use of different instruments over time and incorporated different instruments. I'm fully confident that we can adapt also to this. I mean, maybe the scale is a little bit different in terms of the impact, but I do see it as part of that same evolution of what it means to have reliable inferences from the scientific work. But I think it's helpful to parse it out because of the role of infrastructure and the role that the community plays in embracing these issues that are traveling with the use of computational methods, which includes data. And this isn't, so the paper and pencils, you kind of have control, right? Like entirely, and same with the mathematics, right? So when you actually put forward those ideas, that's something that you know, it's a very reasonable expectation that you would be able to deliver that, right? Something like computation, I think we are much more kind of community-based in terms of what it means to produce those computational results. It's just the reality of doing the computation that the skills are distributed, the resources are distributed, and somehow this needs to all kind of come together. And I have more on that coming up. Okay, I'm going to try to make that more clear. Okay, so there's one. So we have I think we have an essential community approach to this. This is not a question of one researcher should or should not be doing things differently in their own particular pipeline. This is a question of how can we support reproducible practices? How can we find out what those actually are, what works in different research, you know, categorizations. What does it mean for a funding agency to support work that's reproducible? Does it mean more money? Does it mean funding different types of work? What does it mean to publish that work? I just discussed with you how that may not be a PDF, right, going forwards with words. So what does it mean to actually think about the publisher side? There's a role for universities both in thinking about hiring, promoting faculty and researchers, and what do those sort of tracks and ladders actually look like? And also for libraries situated within universities in terms of thinking about infrastructure, preservation, stewardship of all of these results. I'm trying to make this subtle argument, they're no longer just a paper or a number or a figure. They've got a lot of kind of encumbrances on the computational side, including data, computational methods, and so on. We have been impacted by memos from the Obama White House, right? The Office of Science and Technology Policy around public access. They talked about data in 2013. So regulatory bodies, scientific societies, training, bringing communities together. So how do we start kind of involving and engaging the relevant pieces here in ways that are coordinated and can work together, when of course we do not have a coordination mechanism. By design, we don't have coordination mechanisms. It's all sort of climbing step by step around and around Mount Kilimanjaro until we get to the top. So sometimes people ask the question, well, you've been talking about reproducibility for a long time, like, so how's it going? And and this is what I say, right? I actually see a lot of progress, like enormous amounts of progress. I think we hit a tipping point about 2 years ago and things are sort of accelerating. If you want to stand back and look at how most people are kind of doing their work and where reproducibility measures up, that's a different framing and it's slow. And I think it's fine, but we get there together, right? Okay, so this is sort of continuing the discussion of how community efforts are advancing. So with a group of authors here, we put together, this is essentially recommendations that came from a workshop at AAAS in 2016. And we brought this workshop together to do a couple of things. So one is think about, remember it's 2016, we were thinking about sort of what could we say about reproducibility that might be actionable or useful in the community or sort of galvanize some efforts in the community. And also, we felt there is a lot of talk, at least at that time and I think also now, that is in this space that focuses on data, sort of open data and exposure of data. We wanted to foreground software, reproducibility, and sort of the discovery environments that the data are actually embedded within and that provide meaning to the data. So we wanted to sort of be a little bit, sort of encourage a little more of a holistic view around exposure of research from data to sort of expand it. So I have a little access to the computational steps taken to process data and generate findings is as important as access to the data themselves. So that was our key. So we put 7 recommendations together. This is not just our work. It came from the workshop, so this was a collaborative effort between the workshop participants. I'll mention them very quickly, and then what I'd like to do is then show how these are, in some sense, we have built on them for the National Academy's report. So the first recommendation is the one you might expect, which is share these products of research, right? Data, software, workflows. Put them in trusted open repositories. I think we no longer need to put them on our own website, for example. There are professionals who manage and steward all of these things, so we can put them in these open trusted repositories. So that was our first recommendation. Get permanent identifiers for those objects and put those links in your paper somewhere, right? So maybe you can get it in the abstract, that's great. Maybe you can get it in the reference section, that's even better. Maybe you have to put it in acknowledgments or footnotes or in the text. It just kind of depends on the journals. Remember, we're going around Mount Kilimanjaro and they're kind of like slowly evolving. So people, like sort of different publishers have different standards. But get your links in there to the objects that produced your work. You can certainly do that before publication. And I love it if you can get that in the reference section because you're giving already information to people who, if they do use any of your work, they reuse your data, they manage to use some of your code, for example, they like some of your methods and can repurpose it in their work. They've got a ready-made citation there. So just go ahead and put in. We are evolving citation standards for data, for code, for other aspects of the workflow, the computational workflow. There's not widely accepted standards yet, so just do your best. Put the information in there that you can, versions and so on, URL and so on. We don't yet have BibTeX entry for data code, these objects. So just use MISC and let's just go for it, and we'll keep evolving our standards. Something that really has been very difficult to talk about up until maybe the last couple of years is around levels of documentation that are appropriate for delivering these objects, but that's something there needs to be information and context with all of these articles or items that get actually delivered. One thing I have done a lot of work in, but I won't have time to talk about it today, happy to talk about it afterwards or whenever you might have time, is the use of open licensing on all of these objects as you share them to enable community members to reuse these objects. People sometimes don't realize that things like software are automatically copyright by you. You don't have to do anything about that. So even putting software out on the web, no one can legally use it unless you are licensing it or giving them permission to do that. So you have to affirmatively take that step. So go ahead and do that. Journals can play a role. They can check on reproducibility. They can check for the existence of these artifacts and so on. It says here the top standards. Happy to talk about that. Those are the transparency and openness promotion standards that have come from the Center for Open Science, another collaborative process. And then we encourage funding agencies to recognize that reproducibility is not an obvious thing that people should do and aren't doing. It's actually a really hard thing, and the way to do it is not clear. So maybe it's not necessarily clear in all cases. And so maybe thinking about funding initiatives or programmatic initiatives that can look into some of the more complex issues from a research perspective around reproducibility. For example, sharing data that has maybe privacy or confidentiality concerns associated with it and sort of other challenging questions. So let's go forward to this year. So where are we 2019 from 2016? These are a different group of people, right? There's some overlap, but a different group of people. And I pulled out 4 key recommendations from the National Academy's report. Now, again, this is like a wall of text, which I'm not intending for you to read. I'm just going to point out the salient issues here. I just wanted to be complete and put it up there so you have the whole recommendation if you are interested. But our first recommendation in the report is very similar to the previous recommendation in the sense of share your stuff. Right? Researchers should convey clear, specific, complete information about any computational methods or data products that support their published results to enable replicability, reproducibility, repeatability, and so on. And then we talked here about input data, methods, hopefully in code, information about the computational environment where the experiments were actually run or analyzed, for example. Okay, so that was recommendation 1. Two others that I've pulled out are around funding agencies. So with this National Academies report, we were charged by the NSF to come up with this report. So we delivered these findings and recommendations back to the NSF. So you do see in our recommendations a focus on the NSF, that these were the people who, in a sense, commissioned the report through National Academies. We are thinking broadly about the community, but you certainly will see in both of these points that there's target towards NSF, and actually in the next recommendation too. So funding agencies invest in research and development of open source, usable tools and infrastructure that support reproducibility. Our next recommendation, funding agencies could be more deliberative about understanding how uncertainties would be evaluated, for example, in a proposal or a grant, and also take into account any relevant issues regarding replicability and computational reproducibility. So one of the things we suggested is funders could introduce review of reproducibility and replicability guidelines and activities into merit review criteria. And thinking about this could be ways to enhance both of those. Okay. So here's this sort of next recommendation targeted again to NSF. NSF could establish criteria for trusted open repositories so that when we are sharing these products, we have some sense of where they should go and some kind of guidance around this. Harmonization with other funding agencies. You certainly don't want any researcher to be in a position of complying with sort of NSF guidance and being not in compliance with NIH or DOE guidance for other grants they might have, for example. So certainly harmonization is important. Think about creating or endorsing code data repositories to support NSF-funded work. You probably are aware that NIH has now entered into a partnership with Figshare to support products from NIH-supported grants, for example, data products. So NSF could think, maybe not Figshare, but think about how it might start to think about supporting where those products actually land. It does this for articles, right, for the PDFs. So, but what about the other aspects of reproducibility? We also suggested that NSF could think about leveraging its data management plan. Right? The data management plan was put in place in 2011. It's 2 pages of free text. And it could include more than data, which is what most data management plans refer to. And it could think more clearly about reproducibility and ways to make data management plans actionable, for example, or machine readable. I've done some work in that area, are things we recommended in that report. And then also thinking about research and developing alternative mechanisms when it's not straightforward to share very large code bases, for example, that were developed over 20 years and never developed open source, for example. So how do we start thinking about what to do in those contexts? As I mentioned, if data has confidentiality aspects or privacy issues in it, or it's developed in collaboration with industry, for example, we need to start navigating all of those issues as well and think about what it looks when we actually start implementing some of these ideas. Okay, we actually had a recommendation in here about Mount Kilimanjaro, so I didn't use those words, but this is the kind of it takes a village recommendation that many stakeholders have a role to play. Educational institutions, professional societies, engaging expert colleagues in areas where researchers don't necessarily have expertise. It could be in non-domain, non-traditional sort of domain, non-traditionally domain areas like computational infrastructure, for example, like statistical analysis, for example. And our last one is NSF considering funding activities that promote computational reproducibility. So just in these 2 kind of snapshots I've given you around how recommendations have evolved, I think you can start to see that we're becoming more sophisticated in how we think about this and more sensitive to the nuance, I think, in this topic. Okay, so how do we think about applying these ideas? So I think there are many different ways to think about how we might approach some of these notions meaningfully, if that's something that we want to do. And one that I'm going to put forward today I call the life cycle of data science. So there is a notion in the information sciences called the life cycle of data. And so if you think about this from, say, a curator's perspective, the idea roughly is how do we sort of follow a data set through its steps of being used and shared, curated, and then actually having another person, entity, organization sort of be able to actually reuse that, and then it sort of goes through that life cycle again, right? The life cycle of data, which has been around in 20 years, something like that in the information science, is very focused on a data set. And so what I'm trying to do here is say, okay, maybe we can take this life cycle idea, which inherently has notions of reuse and reproducibility in it, right, as these objects move from one researcher through a system probably involving libraries, curators, stewardship, and so on, out to another researcher. Maybe we can start to leverage that in thinking about data science. So once you start thinking about sort of these actors in data science, there's a lot going on. And so the question is, how do we organize all these kind of different pieces and components of a data science discovery pipeline to make these things clear and potentially actionable and understand this better? So clarifying the steps in data science projects, like who's involved, what types of tools and infrastructure are involved, reproducibility through that life cycle of data science. It can help guide implementations around infrastructure and incorporate things like ethics. So, you know, everyone knows that, I think I can more narrowly say maybe AI and machine learning aspects of data science, but have been beaten up in the press over the last few years around some of the ethical issues. So a life cycle approach, now this is directly imported from the life cycle of data approach, there's ethical components at each step in the way. We can do that as well with a life cycle of data science and consider our ethical steps as we go through. Reproducibility, how does this pertain to curriculum development, for example, training, other programmatic initiatives that we might be developing in and around data science? This helps us develop these areas and reward these areas too. So for example, there's people sometimes say, why don't you just hire great programmers on your projects if you're so worried about having sort of good software that's reusable and so on. Okay, so you're up against, I don't know, some colleagues have accepted offers at sort of your big high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, upwards of $500,000 a year, plus stock options and so on. And they get, they're not tied to grants that expire in like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And they're working in a situation where, you know, they're really an integral part of the team. So why aren't we hiring them? You know, so we also want to think about who are sort of, who are the important contributors on these teams and how do we reward them? Okay, so this is also a blizzard of words. So let me just step you through it first on the colors. So this is what I put together for a life cycle of data science. I think it does reflect the complexity in sort of a data science project, but let's just look at the three colors here. So the yellow one, I call it the application level here, and this is what you might think of as the science discovery aspect. So what it's doing is so I should say the life cycle of data science is an abstraction. The actual manifestation for any particular project or any particular data set in the life cycle of data would be customized, right? So this is just an abstraction, and it's not meant to dictate anything about how you might do data science, but different elements you might consider in thinking about a data science project. So one way you could go through a pipeline from the application level or scientist level, experimental design, data management plan, for example, then obtaining, collecting your data, generating your data, building your data models, whoever's involved in that step, doing data exploration or hypothesis generation, for example. Then after that, you might move to something like data organization, cleaning, restructuring, getting it ready for analysis. And then you might step to model estimation or some type of statistical inference from that data set that you have prepared to do statistical inference. Maybe you'll do some cross-validation, some simulation to check your results, visualization, and then our last step, artifact, manuscript, publication, archiving for reuse and reproducibility. So from a scientist perspective, maybe that's one type of set of steps that you would go through from a data science perspective. Now let's decorate that pipeline with other aspects that are involved in every step of the way. So let's drop down to the green level. So this one I call the infrastructure level. So at each step here, there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence here, but at each level, there's something going on at the computational level that is integrally involved in that discovery pipeline. So our experimental design data design, our sort of data management plan. We're using different types of documentation, workflow software perhaps in there, obtaining, collecting database, building our data models. Perhaps we are using and relying on database structures there, perhaps even doing some design and innovation at the database level. Data exploration, hypothesis generation, we're using maybe pre-registration tools, other types of workflow tracking software. Data preparation, doing things like imputing missing values, normalization, all of this. Lots of people use notebooks, for example. So we always have this tooling kind of associated. I'm going to just stop for your question.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the terminology here. So
Yeah.
You say life cycle of data science.
Yeah.
But it's actually life cycle of science.
Okay, let's
really
strike
see
out
the-
data. So the reason I leave data in there is because I can do terrific science with no computational component at all, right? So I could do, for example, so mathematical derivations, for example, I think those certainly count as sort of scientific research. I don't necessarily, could certainly have a computational component, I don't necessarily have it. Data science, it's in there, right? We're not getting away from the computation, yeah.
Say that in my domain we do every one of those steps, but we don't call ourselves data scientists. So I'm just wondering, does this, I mean, I'm just trying to reinforce the point here that this is a general applicability, right? That this
Thank you, yeah.
not specific to
Yeah.
data
People
science.
who label themselves data scientists, yes, absolutely agree. So I wonder how I can make that more clear. Well, I'll think about it, yeah. Okay, so the point of the green is that every time we're doing our scientific steps, we're using some tooling. And I don't think that's necessarily explicitly recognized. Most of the time, I see scientists being extremely innovating about repurposing tooling that was designed for something, sometimes an industry application, and making it work in a situation that works for them as scientists. Excel is a great example. It's accounting software, right? And other thing, even the containerization, none of that was developed for scientists. We're sort of using it pretty broadly now, but that was for managing sort of, big farms of VMs, right? In industry settings, like web applications, for example, not necessarily what we would use it for. So this is encouraging us to think about how integral our computational infrastructure really is every step of the way and take it really seriously. The tool design, it's fundamentally what enables us to do the questions and answers that we would like to do. We all know that we are controlled by the tools in some sense, and the tool can't do it. We either innovate on the tool or we don't do it, right? Okay, so those are sort of they're made the same size for a reason. Overarching over the top, the sort of gray arrows there, these are I call it the science of data science. So thinking about what are these sort of broader issues of applicability across that life cycle. So I have things in there about reproducibility, artifact reuse, ethics, documentation all the way through, metadata creation all the way through. Regulation, legal considerations. So are you thinking about privacy concerns, other types of regulatory boundaries that you might run into when you merge data or link data, just to take an example. The licensing and sharing of these artifacts as you're creating them, as you're engaging with collaborators and partners. Are you sorting all these legal issues out as you go around sort of exposure of the work? Is everyone on the same page with it? So things like data governance can be foregrounded, stewardship, best practices around archiving, research, for example, as we go through. These are overarching concerns. So really kind of studying the science of data science as we're instantiating and developing these concepts as we go. At the very bottom, so we have this also sort of underlies all our computational efforts. So we have sort of the tooling level, but then of course we have system levels, right? And this is not something that a scientist might necessarily be thinking about when they deploy their experiments and investigations and sort of generate their conclusions. But are we using and leveraging specialized hardware, cloud compute infrastructure, another place where we're largely adapting infrastructure made for industry and making it work for us, for better or for worse. Data warehousing architecture, storage capabilities, even things like you see Google developing TPUs, for example, sort of at that hardware level. Are there hardware innovations that we need to be thinking about or not in terms of the life cycle of data science and the production of scientific knowledge from these activities? So this schematic is meant to say there's a broad layer of concerns, these sort of science of data science concerns that travel with our investigations across the life cycle of data science, in addition to what's in our face, which is our own sort of experimental steps and the implementation. And this all lies on top of complex, meaningful, sometimes scientifically meaningful hardware and infrastructure. Okay. All right, so that was a busy slide. Okay, so what can we do with some type of understanding of this computational pipeline / cycle? We bring in and recognize salient points like ethics. So ethicists have a role with this conceptualization of the life cycle of data science, as do many other actors. I just sort of pulled them out. Same with data managers. Resources like your compute resources that much data science is reliant on, and the cyber infrastructure too becomes actors in this space. So we can, perhaps, thinking through different framings for data science and the different moving parts that are involved, improve our understanding of how best to advance data science. So looking at these different components, are there places where it makes sense to do more investment, where it's easier to get some wins, and places where maybe it doesn't make sense, and we can start looking at these things holistically. That pipeline also, I think it helps us get to one of the places we started this discussion where we may want to compare different pipelines and different results. So we can work through these technologies and see what is different, for example, between the different workflows that people may have used to get their output. And fundamentally, the sort of real punchline is hopefully these activities then have us producing better science, better data science, greater social impact in positive ways, right? Okay, so one of the ways that we have been trying to take some of these ideas from framing, particularly the salience of the infrastructure aspects around data science and the importance of the infrastructure aspects, is a project that I have been working on. I'm a co-PI on the project. Bertram Ludescher is our PI. So 5 institutions are working cooperatively on this project. We're in year 4 of a 5-year project, so now we're getting to where we have something that's usable, and we're putting some of these ideas in place. So I wanted to just give a quick example of one approach that we've been taking on the infrastructure side to sort of enable some of these ideas, specifically around reproducibility and what that might mean and how that might be advanced, just thinking about the tooling underneath. Okay, so we called it whole tail because we want to capture the entire story of the research that goes on in a data science project. So we want to get like the entire story, right? And then we called it whole tail as well because we had a specific focus on supporting and capturing research in what is called the long tail, which maybe they have small data sets, or like relatively small data sets. They may create them one-off for a particular study, same with their codes, for example. A lot of science is done that way. Sort of in contrast to, say, HPC or sort of big infrastructure at scale work. So we sort of wanted to basically get the whole tail, because we're going to get all small tail as well. Okay, so our main focus is reproducibility here. And we carried out this work in a very sort of community and data-driven way. We engaged scientists as we went and so on. And so whole tail is a place where you can actually go to wholetail.org, and we would love it if you tried it out and told us things that were wrong and so on. But you can go there and actually do work in tools that many scientists use. So we chose to focus on RStudio and Jupyter Notebooks, so those are supported in there. So it should be extremely familiar. Like, our idea is not that scientists need to learn some whole new set of tools. The idea is support scientists where they are. And then what we do is we actually enable the bundling of the output from that research into a reproducible object that we call a tail. And you can just sort of click the publish button, and then you get this kind of reproducible bundled, handed off actually to a repository. That's an output you could get as a researcher. Okay, so I think I mentioned some of this. We have our quantitative environments like Jupyter, RStudio, and so on, OpenRefine. And then it pushes out after the analysis to, right now, Data 1, Dataverse, working with Zenodo, right, to make sure that we can actually, they will ingest our tails. So you could register data, for example, once you're in the whole tail system. Let's say, in this case, we started up in RStudio. interface. And then that we call the tail. So in this case, it could be augmented with, for example, specialized tools like Rocker, for example. You mount your data, which could be external. And then we do all the work within a Docker container. And then after that, the analysis is done. This is pushed out to a repository. Here we just say data 1, and it's exported in formats that make it accessible and ingestible by other objects and are standardized. Okay. All right, so the tail contains narrative, code, data, workflow information, sort of these objects that researchers may want to share to go with notions of reproducibility. It also allows, if I want to pick up a tail and it's been used previously, I can do that and extend it. I can work on other people's tails, for example, so I could immediately get in there, reproduce their work, presuming permissions are in place, right? But reproduce their work, apply their scripts and so on to new data that I might have, or take data and have a new method of analysis that I actually have worked on, for example. So it allows this kind of extension of the work, or sort of what some people on the team called remix, right, between the sort of different facets of the pipelines, for example. Okay, so I think I mentioned the tail. And so this is what our sort of splash page looks like. There's different sort of tails that are up there that you could investigate or reproduce and so on. You create, if you're starting a new project, you create a tail, and here you can see we have Jupyter Notebook, Jupyter with Spark, Jupyter Lab, for example, OpenRefine, RStudio, and so on, and we're kind of adding these more front ends. And the idea is if you had front ends you preferred to work in, that could be customizable by a user as well. Then it looks just like what you expect, right? So it's just like a regular RStudio session, like exactly what you're expecting. It's just sort of decorated by the fact that you're in a browser. Okay, it's not, sort of has some of my text on there, but okay. So the idea you can sort of explore within these tails. Okay, so we can expose tails for review, for example, prior to publication, and support reproducibility and reuse was our main goal. So we've got kind of stuff working. Yeah.
It's a really neat idea, but I was wondering, is this more applicable to some types of data than others? Because you mentioned the question about permissions. So, for example, I work with human subjects. We have a lot of personally identifiable information.
So we're not HIPAA compliant.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, like a lot of that stuff, you wouldn't want to tail with your data.
So when we publish the tail, we'll publish the reference to the data. So you could still use it for publication. You would have whatever your reference, like DOI, whatever it is, URL for the data. However, I would not recommend bringing private or sort of human subjects data, any type of confidential, into Wholetail as a platform itself. I mean, you're working in containers that have security leaks and so on. So that's not a use case we do a good job at this point, mainly because it's hard to provide that level of sort of security for those types of data. So we haven't focused on that yet. We could in the future, but that's a case where I would say don't bring your data in there. Okay, so the last part of my talk. So this is exploratory new work that I have been doing. So I just have warning that it's under construction. And this is actually the first time that I've presented the work. So this is as I said, the last part of the talk where I wanted to mention, or at least float some ideas about where things could be going. And this is maybe not something that's achievable tomorrow. But thinking about why we might be doing this or what the benefits are to doing this. So I've been thinking about what would it mean if we really were publishing or sharing computational research? Or what would things look like if we were in this world of radical transparency the way that we've been discussing today? So things like code is available or data is available and so on. Reproducibility is in place. So in a sense, what we would be building is a scholarly record as a data set, right? Not so much as a collection of PDFs, right? So if our results were organized into a data set, say with the underlying reproducibility aspects in there, what would that look like? So that's something I'm calling the computable scholarly record. And so I could see a couple of things that immediately would be useful about something like that. So then we would have a test bed for thinking about what reproducibility means. How do I share these results in a way that's meaningfully reproducible? Or when do we sort of find exceptions and so on. Also reliability, so for these results that are in there, can I have some metrics and some understanding of what it actually means to maybe apply them in new data sets or new settings, for example. And it would allow us to have a way to deploy and test infrastructure development, policies, for example. How do I start working out some of these thorny IP issues? From the perspective of a computable scholarly record, I think we would surface pretty quickly data policy issues, software policy issues, other policies and IP issues and so on that would come up. We could actually query this data set as we would query any data set, right? So I could think about these sort of meta-analysis or meta-research queries across, say, lines of scientific research contributed to by different researchers. So, for example, I could send a query to this scholarly record and say, return to me a table with effect size, p-values side by side for a certain set of clinical trials, for example. Send me a list of all the denoising algorithms that have ever been used on a particular figure and give me all their citations, for example. So if you're a signal processing person, maybe doing this type of denoising, that would be a very interesting query for which to start a line of research. Return to me all the classifiers, machine learning classifiers that have ever been used on the famous ALL, AML cancer data set, and show me the misclassification rate associated with each of those classifiers. Scrape up all the data that has that are whole genome sequences associated with the BRCA1 mutation, for example. I should be able to query the scholarly record from any work that's been done on that and pull these together. So did I mention that these queries are basically impossible today? We could even start bootstrapping some of these results to learn more about the state of the scientific knowledge itself. So randomly assigning treatment and control labels to cases for a particular clinical trial of interest, calculate effect size. Do this over and over, this random assignment sort of mixing of labels. And then we can get a histogram of the effect sizes for that bootstrap. And then do that for a whole bunch of clinical trials and put them all side by side, for example. I think some of our issues around reproducibility have come from our inability to query the state of the science and actually where we are. So that's a wild, I think a sort of wild proposal in terms of if you think about where we are and where we would need to get to. But we could do things like assume things like re-executability of the pipelines and code, or at least some level of transparency around the computational steps. Apply the methods in new context, pooling data, right? So data studies that have data that are related, we could automatically pool, validate the findings as we go with a computable scholarly record, compare the methods, and sort of organize our information. Maybe most interestingly of all the points to me is we would have our research then organized around research questions, not organized around a journal. Right? So you would actually be able to see this relevant research. We would just ingest it into the scholarly record associated to particular research questions, right? So be able to sort of do these queries across state of the knowledge for particular areas of research. Okay, so something more modest that I'm just going to very quickly just mention, I don't have time to go into it in more detail, is being able to maybe for some pilot projects try to integrate these results in sort of the way that you might start linking these findings to a particular question in an integrated way. So this would be a meta layer on top of our sort of regular scholarly publishing, but with fully stewarded computational aspects. So I think this is my conclusion here. So essentially, I just wanted to say that I think we are on a track to think about some of these issues based on the way that we're approaching our research, not based on me convincing you or sort of ethical precepts. Compute is, of course, becoming much more massive and pervasive all across the research enterprise. This is necessitating, I think, greater transparency just for the sheer complexity of scale and managing the jobs. So I think we are going to be marching towards something like a computable scholarly record just by the fact that we have ambitious scientists who are leveraging and deploying these tools. And so we may as well think about how can we actually, what's the end game? Like how do we actually use the fact that we are becoming natively computational in the way that we're doing and publishing our research? So that's something that does it implies much greater productivity, discovery rates, efficiency in the work. Those are the reasons people would actually use it, not because of my talk. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thank you. Okay, great. No question. Okay. Go ahead.
You showed us the hotel's platform. Is there a
Yeah.
Docker container for that anywhere I can play with and download?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I should have, it's in there, but I went over it very quickly. It's fully open source. So yeah, so it's all the code is on GitHub. We have this organized into, I don't know how easy it is, given that we're still actively developing, but it is all there. In theory, could be stood up anywhere. Right? That's the point of the project. So I don't think we have one Docker container that allows that to happen, but we do have, it is comprised of a collection of Docker containers for the projects too. So those can be exported. That's fundamentally what's underlying the tail, those containers. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. So this is really interesting work. Thanks. So one question that I've seen, and I've thought a little bit about this space and trying to get this to happen in sort of machine learning, but one of the challenges is that the people with the least resources to sort of commit to efforts like this are oftentimes the ones who perhaps are gain the most benefit from efforts like this. And one of the big challenges in ML and I think in other spaces as well is there's lack of incentive for participation because the barrier to entry is high. And so for particularly younger junior faculty who are starting out and they want to sort of achieve some of these goals, but the cost and the resources to get there administratively and overhead and so on is just so high. I mean, do you have thoughts on how to ease that process and how to entice particularly junior scientists?
Yeah, so I think it's entirely accurate. And so there's a couple of things that I think will move us there, but it's slow, right? And I think part of it is this recognition of the importance of infrastructure. So the idea, we still sort of have this idea from funding agency perspective, publication, we have this idea that the publication with the results is really our sort of currency, right? And thinking more broadly, which is what I was sort of trying to do with the life cycle idea, that there's actually now quite a lot that has to travel with that in terms of infrastructure needs and so on. So I hope I didn't convey the message that it's upon the individual researcher to like get their act together, because that's not at all what I meant. It's really part of a community effort that we will get there slowly, but the infrastructure pieces need to come in and be prioritized, and the different sort of actors there around funding agencies. So I think we will get there, and one thing I have told, so junior researchers are often the ones that are most excited about this. They sort of often come from open source software community, and then they're like shocked that these practices like aren't in place, shocked and scared, you know. And so they're often actually early adopters, very enthusiastic about some of this. So that's not so much of an issue I have found. But I do tell them that there's no point, you know, not getting job offers because you spent your time building infrastructure and you have like 2 publications at the end of your PhD. There's just no point to this. You need to do whatever you need to do. Post-tenure people, different story, right? We can do things differently, right? So, but I think the burden is really more on us, I think, to make these changes among the junior faculty, to sort of help pave the way and give them the, that sort of architecture in place for them to succeed in that way. Yeah.
Just one brief comment on that. At my former institution, one of the things they started doing was giving new faculty offers, free money to use the campus research infrastructure office, right? And it was basically paying money to themselves, so it was kind of free in some sense. But it also, at least step 1 would be in hopefully the right direction by talking to someone who hopefully knows.
Yep. So, there's tons of low-hanging fruit here, though. Like, think about a department that offers reproducibility prizes or something. That's super easy for students, for example. We can just sort of do things like that, and super impressive to give them a line on their CV, too. So
I just mentioned we give a reproducibility prize each year.
Yay. Oh, yay, okay. So, like, I'm not even original. but there's just little things like that you can signal and reward people and so on. So, yes, sorry.
So I'd like to ask, what do you have favorite examples of research that is very reproducible and research and like a horror story of research which is very,
Oh,
very much
okay.
not reproducible.
Okay, so, all right, so for reproducible, so there's actually a number of examples that are accessible in Wholetail. And there's one in there where there is, this is actually, I think, University of Chicago-based research that's in there on material science and applying machine learning models to compound discovery in material science. So that's one that's in there that is super reproducible and phenomenal, in my opinion. I'm not a material scientist, but to me it looks like phenomenal work. Horror stories, like, just open a journal. I mean, I'm not even joking. Like, it's very hard, even if you have data, it's very hard to go from data to results where you're accurately, you have some confidence that you're actually doing what the author did, right? If you don't have the computational pipeline that connects the two. So the biggest horror story I can think of is probably the work that was done at Duke a few years ago in genomics. People probably know this is Anil Cody's work with, I'm forgetting the lab head's name, but quite a lot of, I think 13 retractions they ended up at the end of it because of the irreproducibility and the sort of subsequent pulling back the covers on some of what was going on in that work. That was kicked off by the fact that they were working in genomics and genomic data is open, and they were able to at least start from somewhat comparable data sets, right, to actually understand what was going on. If they hadn't had open data, it may never have been discovered. Right.
That's all the time we have.
Okay.